In our last video on the gap theory, we looked at the fact that Satan was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And so therefore, the fall of Satan, the fall of Lucifer, could not have taken place between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse number 2. It would have had to have taken place between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. So the real gap that we find in the Bible to put where Satan fell is between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, the chapters, not verses. Now, someone may say, well, is there any other indicators in the biblical text that would give us maybe a time frame of how long of a time period was within that gap? Now, gap theorists who believe between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 believe there could be thousands to billions of years in that gap of time. The Bible gives a more definitive period of time, if you will, or at least we can get close to figuring out the time frame of the gap between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. In Genesis chapter 4, and I believe this is where we get our time from. In Genesis 4, the Bible says Adam knew his wife again. This is after Cain has killed Abel. And in verse 25, Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, she said, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. So Eve is saying that Abel was replaced by Seth. Now verse 26, and to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. So Seth is the third named son. He's the son that replaced Abel. Now, you look in chapter 5 and verse number 3, the Bible says Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth. So Adam is 130 years old when Seth is born. Now, the fact that Seth replaced Abel means that their ages should have been relatively close. And I say relatively close. Cain and Abel had to be old enough for Cain to be a farmer and a tiller of the ground, and Abel would have been a shepherd. And so we're possibly in their late teens, early 20s, when Cain kills Abel. Well, if they're in their early 20s, let's just, for argument's sake, say that Cain was 20 years old when Seth was born. So in Cain's late teens, 18, 19 years old, whatever, he kills Abel. Abel is just a little bit younger. He kills Abel. And then let's just throw the number out there. Cain is 20 years old when Seth is born. Adam is 130 years old when Seth is born. So when Seth is born, we know Adam is 130. The Bible definitively says that. And let's just, for argument's sake, say that Cain was 20 years old. And the reason I put that time frame in there, if Cain is in his 50s or 60s by the time Seth is born, then there's been many sons born since Abel died. They would have had a number of sons. And so if you put in a time frame about 20 years, Cain is 20 years old when Seth is born, then you've got Cain, Seth, and a few daughters, Cain and Abel, and then a few daughters, and then Seth being born. And the time frame seems to work out a little bit better. But just for argument's sake, let's say it's about 20 years old when Seth is born. Cain is 20 years old when Seth is born. If that's the case, then that means Adam would have been 110 when Cain was born. So if Adam is over, more than likely, if Seth and Cain's ages are, within a 20-year distance of each other, time frame, 20 or 20 so years, and I feel like it should be that, since we would have a lot more sons between Cain and Abel and Seth. And so since Seth replaces Abel, it seems just logical reasoning, just reading of the text, Seth is the third son. Well, Seth is the third son, and Cain is in his early 20s or so when Seth is born. That puts Adam being just over 100 years old when Cain is born. Well, he's just over 100 years when Cain is born, and Cain is not born very long after the fall and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Then you have a possibility of approximately 100 years from the creation of Adam to the fall of Adam. They could have been in the Garden of Eden for 100 years. And so the real gap theory the real gap is found between Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, and you're looking there at possibly 100 years that Adam and Eve were actually in the Garden of Eden. And so that's a substantial amount of time, a gap of time between those two chapters. And I believe the result is, I think you can see, that the fall of Satan and the fall of the angels does not prove the gap theory, the old-fashioned gap theory. It actually hurts the old gap theory and helps the arguments of the young earth creationist instead.